Christmas Day arrived the way it always did in that town. Quietly, almost gently, as if the world itself had learned to lower its voice out of respect. Snow lay like a clean sheet over the streets, softening edges, muting footsteps, turning even the most ordinary corners into something reverent. Houses glowed from the inside out, windows lit with the kind of warmth that promised food on the stove, laughter in familiar rooms, and stories told for the 100th time. Church bells rang in steady intervals, not urgently, not loudly, but faithfully, marking time, marking tradition, marking a sense of order everyone trusted without question. This was the kind of day when nothing was supposed to go wrong. Christmas in this town was not just a holiday. It was a ritual, almost sacred in its predictability. Families woke at the same hours they always had. Coffee brewed, wrapping paper piled up in corners. People dressed carefully, knowing they would be seen, knowing they would be remembered as part of the scene. The church stood at the center of it all, both physically and emotionally, its doors opening and closing like a heartbeat as people came and went, carrying casseroles and books and unspoken expectations of peace. And yet, somewhere within those ordinary, glowing hours, someone vanished. Not dramatically, not violently. There were no screams slicing through the cold air, no doors kicked open, no shattered glass glinting in the snow. There was no moment anyone could later point to and say, "That's when it happened." Instead, the disappearance slid into the day almost invisibly, like a shadow stretching as the sun lowered, unnoticed until it was suddenly everywhere. At first, there was no alarm. Why would there be? It was Christmas. People ran late. Plans changed. Phones went unanswered because they were left on kitchen counters or tucked into coat pockets. Silence, on a day like this, meant nothing at all. It was ordinary. It was expected. Someone didn't arrive where they said they would. A chair remained empty at a table already crowded with food. A gift sat unopened beneath a tree, its tag still neatly written. There were glances at the clock. Small jokes made to cover the unease. They'll be here soon. You know how they are. Probably stop to help someone. Christmas is generous with excuses. As the afternoon drifted into evening, the town remained wrapped in its seasonal illusion. Lights blinked on porches. Snow continued to fall, erasing tracks almost as soon as they were made. Inside the church, voices rose together in hymns that spoke of hope, of light entering darkness, of lost things being found. No one yet realized how cruelly ironic those words would become. The absence still didn't feel like absence. It felt temporary, incomplete, like a sentence that simply hadn't finished yet. What made this disappearance so unsettling? What would haunt the town for decades to come was not just that someone was gone, but that the world around them refused to acknowledge it at first. Christmas Day is loud in its own way, crowded with meaning, saturated with togetherness. It leaves very little room for noticing what's missing. And so the day carried on, almost protectively, as if it were shielding the truth from being seen too soon. By the time concern began to surface, it did so quietly. A phone call placed with hesitation. A knock on a door that felt unnecessary, but suddenly couldn't be avoided. The first question was not what happened, but have you heard from them? Even then, no one spoke the word missing. It felt too extreme, too dramatic, too inappropriate for a day like this. Night came early, as it always does in winter. The sky darkened, and the town leaned further into its lights, into its traditions, into its certainty that tomorrow would bring explanations. Somewhere between the last carols and the final dishes washed and set aside, the realization began to take shape. Not sharply, not all at once, but slowly, painfully. Someone had not just failed to show up, someone had vanished. What made it worse was the way the day looked afterward, when people would replay it in their minds. The perfection of it, the calm, the way nothing seemed disturbed. No sign that a life had quietly slipped out of the frame. The snow, which had seemed so beautiful, now felt complicit, covering, concealing, smoothing over anything that might have told a different story. In later years, people would ask the same question again and again, phrased in different ways, but always circling the same impossible idea. How does someone disappear on Christmas Day? How does a person vanish when everyone is paying attention to everyone else? When doors are open, when routines are rigid, when faith and familiarity are supposed to keep danger at bay. The truth was, Christmas didn't prevent the disappearance. It hid it, and as the town slept that night, full, tired, convinced the day had ended as it always did, no one yet understood that something had broken beneath the surface. Not just a routine, not just a family, but the belief that some days are too sacred for darkness to enter. By the time the sun rose again, the world would feel different. The silence would no longer be comforting. The unanswered absence would no longer feel temporary. And Christmas Day, once remembered only for warmth and light, would become the day everything quietly went wrong. To understand why the disappearance felt so impossible, you have to understand the town itself, not just its streets or its buildings, but the invisible rules everyone lived by. This was a place shaped by routine, by familiarity, by the comforting weight of knowing exactly what tomorrow would look like. People didn't just recognize each other. They knew each other, or at least believed they did. Names carried histories. Families carried reputations. And at the center of it all stood the church, older than most of the houses around it, older than many of the grudges and loyalties that quietly defined the town's social order. The church wasn't simply a place of worship. It was where births were announced, where marriages were celebrated, where grief was organized into something manageable. Its basement hosted potlucks, fundraisers, holiday pageants, and meetings that blurred the line between spiritual guidance and civic decision-making. If something mattered in this town, it passed through those walls at some point. If someone was trusted, they were trusted there first. Faith here was less about belief and more about belonging. That sense of belonging created an unspoken promise. Nothing truly bad could happen without everyone knowing. Danger was something that belonged to the outside world, to cities shown on the evening news, to places where people locked their doors without knowing their neighbors. This town took pride in the opposite. Doors stayed unlocked. Children walked home alone. Strangers were noticed immediately, not with suspicion but curiosity. The idea that someone could disappear within these boundaries felt almost offensive, like an accusation against the town's identity itself. The missing person fit seamlessly into this landscape. They were not someone on the margins, not someone drifting in and out of town life. They were woven into it. Their presence was expected at gatherings, their absence noticeable in a way that couldn't be brushed off forever. They had habits, routines, patterns that aligned perfectly with the town's rhythm, which made the disappearance feel less like an event and more like a rupture, something that tore through the carefully maintained illusion of control. After Christmas, conversations changed in subtle ways. People spoke more carefully, choosing words that softened the edges of what they were afraid to say. "It's strange" became the most common phrase. Not alarming, not accusatory, just strange. The town wasn't ready to admit fear yet. Fear implied vulnerability, and vulnerability threatened the image they had worked so hard to preserve. The church, in those early days, became a place of reassurance. Prayer circles formed. Candles were lit. The language used was hopeful, almost insistently so. People prayed not just for the missing person's safe return, but for their own sense of order to be restored. The sermons leaned heavily on trust in God, trust in community, trust that things happen for reasons that don't always reveal themselves immediately. But beneath that reassurance, something quieter was happening. People began to measure their words. Certain questions went unasked. Certain possibilities were never voiced aloud. It wasn't denial in a dramatic sense. It was preservation. To question too deeply was to suggest that the town systems, its faith, its relationships, its central institutions, might not be as protective as everyone believed. And so, the town closed ranks. This wasn't a conscious decision, not something voted on or discussed openly. It happened in small, almost imperceptible ways. A conversation that ended too quickly, a look exchanged and then dismissed, a feeling of discomfort that people chose not to sit with for too long. The church continued to host gatherings, and attendance remained strong, but the atmosphere shifted. There was a heaviness now, an unspoken understanding that something was wrong, even if no one could quite define what that something was. Trust, once absolute, became conditional. The disappearance didn't just remove one person from the town. It altered the way everyone else saw each other. Familiar faces were suddenly studied a little longer. Routines were noticed more closely. Yet at the same time, there was a strong pull toward normalcy, toward pretending that life could continue exactly as it always had if everyone just tried hard enough. The church played a crucial role in maintaining that balance. It offered structure when uncertainty threatened to spread. It provided language that framed the situation as a test rather than failure. And for many, that was enough. The idea that the truth might be uncomfortable, might even implicate the very institutions meant to protect them, was something few were ready to confront. In towns like this, silence is often mistaken for peace. As days turned into weeks, the disappearance settled into the background of daily life, not resolved but contained. It became something people referenced carefully, like a fragile object that might shatter if handled too roughly. The church bell still rang. The calendar still moved forward. On the surface, nothing had changed, but underneath, the town was no longer as solid as it once believed. The trust that had once felt unbreakable now depended on collective agreement not to look too closely. And while everyone continued to gather in the same spaces, especially beneath the church's roof, there was a growing sense that some truths, if uncovered, might not just explain the disappearance, but unravel the very fabric of the town itself. What no one said out loud, but many began to feel, was this: if someone could vanish here on Christmas Day of all days, then maybe the town wasn't as safe as it claimed. Maybe the rituals and routines were not shields, but distractions. And maybe, somewhere within the places they trusted most, something had already gone terribly wrong. When people later tried to understand how it all happened, they always returned to the same place in their minds: the last ordinary hours. Not because those hours offered answers, but because they stubbornly refused to. There was nothing dramatic to point to, nothing that rose above the quiet rhythm of the day. And yet, those hours would be replayed again and again, stretched thin under the weight of hindsight, examined for meaning they never seemed to reveal. The morning began like any other Christmas morning. The missing person woke up in a world that felt familiar and predictable. The air was cold, the light pale and gentle as it filtered through winter clouds. There were small tasks to be done, things so routine they barely registered as moments worth remembering. Getting dressed, checking the time, mentally running through the day's plans. These were not the actions of someone preparing to disappear. They were the actions of someone expecting to return. People who saw them that day would later describe nothing unusual. No agitation, no urgency. If anything, there was a calmness that felt appropriate for the holiday. A few words exchanged in passing. A smile that didn't linger long enough to seem meaningful at the time. These details would become precious later, not because they revealed something hidden, but because they were all that remained. There was a plan for the day. Maybe not a rigid schedule, but a loose understanding of where they were supposed to be and when. A visit planned, a meal expected. The kind of soft commitments people make on holidays, assuming time will bend around them. They mentioned heading out briefly, perhaps to run an errand, perhaps to stop by somewhere familiar. It didn't raise concern. It fit neatly into the shape of the day. And then they stepped out into the cold. The town was moving slowly, still half asleep beneath its blanket of snow. Cars passed occasionally, tires crunching softly against the road. Neighbors nodded at one another, exchanging brief holiday greetings. The world felt suspended, as if nothing existed beyond the boundaries of this small, peaceful place. The missing person moved through it, without drawing attention, without leaving an impression strong enough to anchor the moment in anyone else's memory. That was the cruelest part. They didn't vanish in a way that demanded to be remembered. Later, people would fixate on tiny fragments of interaction. Someone thought they saw them near the church. Someone else remembered a conversation that lasted no more than a minute. Another recalled noticing the time when they passed by, but not why the moment stuck. Each memory was incomplete, unreliable on its own, and frustratingly difficult to assemble into a coherent picture. The ordinary nature of it all became deeply unsettling. Holidays are supposed to make moments stand out. They're supposed to sharpen memory, give events a sense of importance. But this day resisted that. It blurred. It softened. The hours slid past without friction. and in doing so, they allowed a disappearance to unfold without resistance. At some point, the missing person was supposed to turn back, to retrace their steps, to re-enter the flow of the day. That moment never came. There was no sound to mark it, no signal that something had gone wrong. The absence didn't announce itself. It waited. As the day moved on, others carried on with their own routines. They assumed the missing person was simply delayed, caught up in holiday obligations, or choosing to enjoy a quiet moment alone. These assumptions felt reasonable, even generous. Christmas has a way of encouraging trust, of convincing people that nothing bad is happening just because it's inconvenient to imagine otherwise. It wasn't until later, much later, that the timeline began to matter. When concern finally crept in, the last ordinary hours became a fixed point of obsession. People asked the same questions repeatedly, hoping repetition might produce clarity. What time did they leave? What were they wearing? Did they say anything unusual? Did they seem distracted? Each answer led nowhere. The details were too small, too benign, too resistant to interpretation. What made those hours so haunting was the realization that, within them, there must have been a moment when everything changed, and no one noticed. The town would come to understand that disappearance doesn't always look like violence or chaos. Sometimes it looks exactly like a normal day. Sometimes it hides behind routine so effectively that by the time anyone realizes something is wrong, the window for understanding has already closed. Those final hours were not dramatic. They were not suspicious. They were simply unfinished. And in that unfinished quality, they left behind a kind of emotional echo, a sense that the story was interrupted mid-sentence, leaving everyone else to guess at how it was supposed to end. In the years that followed, people would swear that if they had known what was about to happen, they would have paid more attention. They would have remembered more. They would have noticed something, anything, that could explain how a person could move through a familiar world and then, without warning, slip out of it entirely. But the truth was harder to accept. There was nothing to notice. No warning signs. No clear turning point. Just a sequence of ordinary moments that, taken together, led to a silence no one was prepared for. And that silence, born in the most unremarkable hours of the most meaningful day of the year, would come to define everything that followed. The first feeling was not fear. It was inconvenience, lightly disguised as concern. A glance at the clock that lingered a second too long. A phone checked, then checked again, as if the screen itself might have made a mistake. Christmas has a way of forgiving delays, and everyone leaned into that forgiveness at first. Someone would show up eventually. They always did. As evening settled in, the tone shifted almost imperceptibly. The daylight faded, and with it, the easy explanations. Meals that were meant to be shared were eaten in fragments. Conversations trailing off as attention drifted back to the same unanswered question. Where were they? The question remained mostly internal, unspoken, as if saying out loud might give it too much power. Phone calls began softly. Casual, almost apologetic. Hey, just checking in. Voicemails were left with cheerful tones that didn't quite match the unease behind them. Each unanswered ring tightened something invisible in the chest. Still, no one said the word missing. It felt too final, too heavy for a holiday night meant to be about joy and gratitude. Outside, the town looked exactly as it should have. Lights glowed steadily in windows. Snow reflected the soft yellow of street lamps. Cars pulled into driveways. Doors closed. Families gathered closer together. From the outside, nothing was wrong. That contrast between the peaceful appearance of the town and the growing unease inside a handful of homes made the fear slow to surface, like something rising underwater. When worry finally broke through, it did so quietly. A second call placed, this time with less patience. A visit to a familiar house, hoping the answer might be waiting there. Each dead, and made it harder to pretend this was still normal. The absence was no longer a gap that could be filled with excuses. It was becoming a presence of its own. By the time night fully settled, concern had spread beyond one household. The questions multiplied, passed from person to person in hushed tones. Had anyone seen them after midday? Did they mention changing plans? Was there somewhere they liked to go when they needed space? Each question carried the same unspoken hope, that someone else knew something reassuring. No one did. The shift from waiting to fear is rarely dramatic. It's not a sudden realization, but a gradual surrender. People stop expecting a simple explanation and begin bracing for something worse. On that Christmas night, the town crossed that threshold without realizing it. The air felt heavier. Conversations grew shorter. Even the laughter that remained sounded forced, as if everyone was performing normalcy for one another. At some point, someone made the call no one wanted to make. It felt like an overreaction, even then. After all, it hadn't been that long. People disappeared for hours all the time. But the timing, Christmas Day, the cold, the darkness, made waiting feel irresponsible. Hope was still there, but it had become fragile, something that needed help to survive. The initial response was cautious. Questions were asked. Notes were taken. A timeline was sketched out on paper, full of blanks and uncertainties. There was still an assumption, quietly shared, that this would resolve itself quickly, that the missing person would be found nearby, embarrassed by the attention, offering an explanation that would let everyone laugh it off later. Searches began with good intentions and little direction. Cars drove familiar routes. Flashlights cut thin beams through the dark, more symbolic than effective. Names were called softly at first, then louder, echoing back unanswered. The snow, which had once seemed peaceful, now swallowed sound, making the effort feel futile. As the hours stretched on, fatigue set in, not just physical, but emotional. Fear doesn't arrive fully formed. It builds as hope erodes. Each passing minute without news made the worst possibilities easier to imagine, even as people tried not to. The mind filled the silence with questions no one wanted to ask. Why hadn't they come back? Why hadn't anyone seen them? Why did the night feel so empty? By early morning, the waiting had transformed into something sharper. The town was awake now, not with celebration, but with unease. Christmas was no longer shielding the situation. It was amplifying it. The idea that this could happen on a day meant for togetherness made the absence feel cruel, almost personal. Fear, once it arrived, didn't leave quietly. It settled in, reshaping how people saw the town around them. Familiar streets felt longer. Dark corners felt darker. The assumption of safety, the unspoken agreement that nothing truly bad happened here, had been cracked, if not completely broken. And still, there were no answers. What began as patient waiting had turned into a shared realization. This was no longer just a delay. Something was wrong. And whatever had taken place had happened quietly, without spectacle, leaving the town to grapple not just with the disappearance itself, but with the terrifying thought that it had happened right in front of them, and they hadn't seen it all. By the time the investigation formally began, the town had already learned its first hard lesson. There would be no obvious starting point, no shattered routine to trace backward, no single moment that explained when concern should have turned into alarm. What investigators were handed instead was absence, clean, undisturbed, and deeply uncooperative. They started where they always did, with timelines. When was the missing person last seen? By whom? At what time? The answers arrived slowly, often secondhand, and almost always qualified with uncertainty. I think it was late morning, sometime after church. I didn't look at the clock. Christmas had softened memory, blurred it, made precision feel unnecessary at the time, and impossible now. Every detail was written down anyway. Clothing descriptions, intended destinations, habits that might suggest where someone would go if they wanted to be alone. Each note felt important, but none of them pointed anywhere concrete. The timeline stretched thin, full of gaps no one could fill. Search areas were mapped based on routine rather than evidence. Roads they often took, places they were known to stop. Familiar buildings, familiar faces. The church appeared repeatedly in these discussions, not because it was suspicious, but because it was central. Everyone passed through it. Everyone trusted it. It was a landmark, not a question mark. And that distinction mattered. The physical search was exhaustive in effort, if not in result. Snow complicated everything. Tracks vanished almost as soon as they formed. Open land offered little shelter and fewer clues. Waterways were checked, outbuildings unlocked, vehicles inspected. Each search ended the same way, with nothing to show for it but cold hands and quiet frustration. What unsettled investigators most was not what they found, but what they didn't. No signs of struggle. No personal belongings discarded or forgotten. No indication that the missing person had intended to disappear. It was as if they had stepped out of the story entirely, leaving the page blank behind them. In cases like this, theories begin to multiply, not because they are strong, but because they are necessary. People need explanations the way they need air. Voluntary disappearance was considered, then quietly dismissed. The missing person had no history of leaving without notice, no signs of planning, no reason, at least none anyone could articulate, to abandon their life on Christmas Day. An accident was another possibility. A slip, a fall, exposure to the cold. But accidents leave traces. They create scenes. They generate questions that can be answered. Here, there was nothing to indicate where such an accident might have occurred. The landscape offered no clues, and the silence refused a break. As days turned into weeks, the investigation slowed, not officially, but perceptibly. Leads dried up. Calls stopped coming in. The urgency that had once fueled long nights and early mornings began to fade, replaced by a grim acceptance that there was nothing new to chase. For the family, this was when the real pain began. In the early days, there had been activity, movement, purpose, the comforting illusion that something was being done. But as the investigation stalled, the stillness became unbearable. Every unanswered question felt heavier. Every quiet phone felt like confirmation of something no one wanted to accept. The town watched all of this unfold with a complicated mix of sympathy and relief. Sympathy for the loss, yes, but also relief that the mystery had not yet demanded anything uncomfortable from them. Without evidence, without suspects, without accusations, the disappearance could remain tragic without being disruptive. Investigations without answers have a strange effect on communities. They don't explode trust. They erode it slowly. People begin to wonder what was missed, what wasn't asked, what wasn't seen. But those questions rarely surface openly. Instead, they linger beneath polite conversations and reassuring words. The church continued to function as a place of support during this time. Prayer services were held. Candles were lit. The language used was careful, focused on hope, on patience, on faith and outcomes beyond human understanding. For many, this was comforting. For others, it began to feel like a way of avoiding harder questions. Investigators, too, felt the pressure of those unasked questions. Cases with no evidence invite scrutiny, even when there is nothing obvious to scrutinize. Files grew thicker with notes, not because new information was found, but because the same information was revisited again and again, each time from a slightly different angle. Eventually, the investigation reached a familiar, painful plateau. There was no official end, no declaration of failure. The case remained open in name, but inactive in practice. Resources moved elsewhere. Attention shifted. The disappearance became something that existed more in memory than in motion. What remained was a vacuum where certainty should have been, where resolution should have lived. The town had answers for most things: births, deaths, marriages, disputes. This was different. This was a question with no shape, no edges, no place to grab hold. And so, the disappearance settled into a new phase. Not solved, not forgotten, but unresolved. A quiet, persistent presence that lingered in the background of daily life. People learned to live around it, to speak of it carefully, to acknowledge it without engaging too deeply. But unresolved mysteries have a way of waiting. They wait in files, in memories, in buildings that outlast the people who pass through them. And though the investigation had found nothing, no trace, no evidence, no truth, it had unknowingly done something else. It had preserved the question. And questions, when left unanswered long enough, do not disappear. They sink. They embed themselves in the foundations of places and people, waiting for the moment when something, anything, forces them back into the light. After the investigation lost its momentum, the town entered a quieter, more complicated phase. There were no search parties anymore, no updates to wait for, No sense that resolution was just around the corner. What replaced all of that was something harder to define, a low, constant hum of uncertainty that threaded itself through daily life. People went back to their routines, but those routines now carried an extra weight, as if something unseen had taken up residence among them. This was when the whispers began. They didn't arrive all at once, and they didn't sound like accusations. Most of the time, they sounded like questions asked too softly to be repeated. Did you ever think it was strange that I always wondered about? Maybe it's nothing, but these sentences rarely finished themselves. They didn't need to. Everyone understood what was being suggested, even if no one wanted to say it clearly. The church remained at the center of town life, just as it always had. Services continued. Events filled the calendar. The basement hosted the same gatherings it always had: potlucks, meetings, rehearsals, holiday preparations. On the surface, nothing had changed, but something subtle had shifted in how people experienced that space. It was no longer just comforting. It was complicated. For years, the church had been the place where worries were supposed to be resolved, or at least reframed into something bearable. Now, it was also a place where questions lingered unanswered. Not openly, not publicly, but in the pauses between conversations, in the way some people avoided certain topics, in the way others lingered a little too long after services, as if hoping someone else might say what they themselves could not. Silence became a kind of agreement. No one declared it, but everyone seemed to understand the boundaries. The disappearance was acknowledged, but only in careful, controlled ways. It was acceptable to express sorrow, acceptable to pray, acceptable to hope. What was not acceptable was speculation that pointed too close to home. The town had already lost one sense of certainty. It was not ready to lose another. And yet, doubt has a way of surfacing no matter how firmly it's pressed down. People began to revisit their own memories. Privately, moments that had once seemed insignificant were replayed with new curiosity. A conversation overheard in passing. A door that had been locked when it usually wasn't. A light seen on late at night. None of these details amounted to anything on their own, but together they created a sense that the story might be incomplete. What made these whispers especially powerful was the absence of an alternative explanation. Without evidence, imagination filled the gap. The mind reaches for patterns when none are offered, and in a town built on familiarity, those patterns inevitably led back to the places and people everyone knew best. Still, nothing was said aloud. The church leadership spoke often about unity during this time, about the dangers of rumor, about the importance of trust. Their words were not unreasonable. In many ways, they were exactly what people wanted to hear. The idea that faith could smooth over uncertainty was deeply appealing. It offered a way forward without requiring confrontation. But for some, that emphasis on unity began to feel less like guidance and more like pressure. The basement, in particular, took on a strange symbolic weight. It was the least visible part of the church, the place where things were stored, sorted, and handled out of public view. It wasn't secret, exactly. Everyone had been there at some point. And yet, it existed beneath everything else, physically and metaphorically. A place that held the remnants of past events, old records, and used furniture, forgotten boxes. People joked about it sometimes, in the way people do when something makes them uncomfortable. But the jokes never lasted long. Years passed, and the whispers never grew loud enough to become accusations. Instead, they settled into the background, becoming part of the town's emotional landscape. New families moved in. Children grew up hearing fragments of the story without ever receiving the full version. The disappearance became something half-known, half-avoided. A local mystery stripped of urgency, but not of impact. What was most unsettling was how easy it became to live with unanswered questions. The town learned to carry the absence without addressing it. Christmas came and went each year, the celebration intact but subtly altered. There was always a moment, usually brief, often unspoken, when the past brushed up against the present. A name not mentioned, a memory quickly redirected. Then the day moved on. In this way, silence did more than protect people from discomfort. It reshaped the truth itself. The longer questions went unasked, the less real they began to feel. Doubt became background noise. Suspicion softened into resignation. But beneath all of that, something remained unresolved. Whispers don't fade because they're answered. They fade because they're absorbed. And in absorbing them, the town unknowingly preserved the conditions that had allowed the disappearance to remain unexplained in the first place. The story was no longer actively being told, but it was still there, embedded in routine and ritual in the quiet spaces beneath familiar buildings. Waiting. Time did what it always does. It kept moving, whether anyone felt ready for it or not. Days became months, months folded into years, and eventually the disappearance no longer occupied the front of people's minds. It drifted backward, settling into memory, into something that belonged to the past. But the past, in this town, never stayed where it was supposed to. For the family left behind, time did not heal in the way people promised it would. It changed the shape of the pain, yes, but it never erased it. In the early years, there was still hope, fragile, exhausting hope that lived in every phone call, every unexpected knock, every unfamiliar face. As the years passed, that hope thinned, stretched between disbelief and resignation. Not knowing became its own kind of grief, one without milestones or closure. Life continued around that absence in uneven ways. Some people moved on quickly, not out of cruelty but necessity. Jobs needed attention. Children grew. New problems demanded space where old ones had once lived. Others remained anchored to the moment everything stopped, unable to fully step forward without leaving something essential behind. Christmas, in particular, became complicated. Each year, the town recreated the same rituals, lights, music, services, shared meals, but the meaning had shifted. What once felt comforting now carried an undercurrent of tension. The holiday that had framed the disappearance never quite recovered its innocence. There was always a moment, however brief, when someone remembered, when the air seemed to change just slightly, before everyone collectively decided to keep going. New generations grew up hearing the story secondhand. It was told carefully, stripped of emotion, often reduced to a few vague sentences. Someone went missing a long time ago. It was never solved. Details blurred with repetition. The person at the center of it all became less real, more symbolic, a figure defined by absence rather than by life. And yet, the emotional residue remained. The church, still standing at the center of town, bore the weight of years without visibly changing. Its walls absorbed weddings and funerals, baptisms and farewells. The basement continued to serve its purpose, quietly holding the overflow of communal life. People passed through those spaces without thinking about what had been lost or what might still be hidden. But unresolved stories have a way of asserting themselves. From time to time, something would stir the past back into awareness. An anniversary, a casual remark from someone new to town, a news story about another disappearance somewhere else. Each time, the old questions resurfaced briefly, then retreated again, as if the town had learned exactly how much of the truth it could tolerate at once. For some, the long stretch of time brought a different kind of clarity. Distance made it easier to admit what had once felt dangerous to consider, that the disappearance was not just a tragedy, but a failure, not of one person, but of a system that preferred comfort over confrontation. These realizations rarely led to action, but they changed how people remembered the past. Silence, once protective, began to feel heavy. The town had lived with the mystery for so long that it became part of its identity. Outsiders found it curious. Insiders found it inconvenient. It was a story that never fully belonged to anyone, which made it easier to leave untouched. Responsibility diffused over time, spreading so thin it became almost invisible. What made this period especially haunting was the illusion of resolution. Nothing was happening, so it felt as though nothing remained to be done. The case was old. The people involved had aged, moved away, or passed on. The idea that the truth could still matter began to feel abstract, even indulgent. But unresolved grief does not expire. It waits quietly, reshaping relationships, influencing decisions in ways people don't always recognize. It shows up in caution where there used to be trust, in hesitation where there used to be certainty. The disappearance had altered the emotional landscape of the town, even for those who barely remembered it. By the time decades had passed, The story existed in layers: the official version, the whispered version, the version people carried privately, shaped by memory and doubt. None of them offered resolution. All of them pointed to the same uncomfortable truth. Something had been lost here, and not just a person. The town had learned to live with that loss, but it had never truly faced it. And so, the years rolled on, building distance without closure. The church bells continued to ring. The seasons continued their cycle. On the surface, everything endured. But beneath that endurance lay a quiet understanding. Time had not solved the mystery. It had only buried it deeper. It didn't begin with suspicion. It rarely does. What finally pulled the past back into focus was something practical, almost mundane, a reason so ordinary it felt unworthy of the history it was about to disturb. Years had passed, and the church, like everything else in town, was showing its age. Pipes needed replacing. Storage needed clearing. Paperwork that hadn't been touched in decades had to be sorted, cataloged, or discarded. No one framed it as reopening old wounds. It was maintenance, preservation, responsibility to the future. The decision to go back downstairs was made without ceremony. The basement had always been there, quietly absorbing the overflow of communal life. Broken chairs, boxes of donated clothes, old decorations carefully labeled and forgotten, filing cabinet stuffed with records that no one quite remembered the purpose of. It was not a place people lingered. It was a place things went when they were no longer immediately useful. As work began, there was an unspoken assumption that nothing of consequence would be found. For others, the truth felt like an attack. It threatened the foundations of their faith, not just spiritually, but socially. The church had been more than a building. It had been a moral reference point. To see it implicated, even indirectly, forced a reckoning that went beyond one disappearance. The town was no longer united in how it remembered its own past. Conversations became sharper. Old arguments resurfaced in new forms. People who had once stood side by side now found themselves on opposite ends of an invisible divide. Those who wanted full transparency, and those who feared what transparency might unravel. What made this moment especially painful was a realization that accountability was not about punishment. It was about acknowledgement. And acknowledgement required admitting that the story everyone had lived with was incomplete. The missing person, once the center of quiet sympathy, now became the center of moral reckoning. Their absence was no longer just a tragedy. It was evidence. Evidence of what happens when institutions choose stability over truth, when communities prioritize harmony over honesty. Some asked why the past had to be disturbed at all. Why now, after so many years? Why reopen wounds that time had at least partially closed? These questions carried genuine exhaustion. People were tired, not just of the story, but of what it demanded emotionally. But others argued that time had not healed anything. It had only numbed it. The truth, once exposed, refused to be neutral. It demanded engagement. It forced people to examine their own roles, however small. Even those who had been children at the time felt implicated, not by action, but by inheritance. They had grown up benefiting from a version of peace that had been purchased with silence, and that realization lingered. The church itself stood unchanged, its walls bearing witness to generations of faith and failure alike. Services continued, though attendance shifted. Some people stayed out of loyalty. Others stayed out of hope that confronting the truth could lead to something better. The past had already been searched, after all, or at least that's what people believed. Whatever had happened all those years ago had happened in the open or not at all. The basement was just a basement. Concrete floors, low ceilings, fluorescent lights that hummed when they were switched on. Still, there was a subtle shift in atmosphere the moment people descended the stairs. It wasn't fear exactly. It was awareness. The sense that this was a space layered with time, holding more than it revealed. Dust coated everything in the same way memory does. Thick in places, untouched in others. Some boxes bore dates written in fading ink. Others had no labels at all, their contents sealed away by neglect rather than intention. As shelves were cleared and cabinets opened, fragments of the past surfaced. Old event programs, handwritten notes, financial records. Nothing unusual at first. Nothing that demanded attention, but the act of sorting itself became unsettling. It forced people to confront how much had been stored and forgotten, how easily things could slip from collective awareness without truly disappearing. At some point, someone paused. It might have been a document that didn't belong where it was found, or a box placed in an odd location, tucked too far back, as if it had been moved deliberately. No alarm sounded. No immediate conclusions were drawn. But something about it felt wrong, not dangerous, not dramatic, just misplaced. That feeling lingered. The work continued, but more slowly now. People began to look more closely, to read instead of skim, to question instead of assume. The basement, once a neutral space, started to feel charged with implication. This was where things ended up when no one knew what else to do with them, where unfinished business quietly accumulated. Someone mentioned the disappearance. Not loudly, almost as an aside. The comment hung in the air longer than expected. It wasn't that anyone believed the basement held answers. It was that, suddenly, it didn't feel impossible that it might. Time had created enough distance for curiosity to return without fear. The people doing the sorting were not the same ones who had lived through the immediate aftermath. They had inherited the story without its original emotional weight, and that made all the difference. As they worked, patterns began to emerge, not clear evidence, but inconsistencies, gaps in records, items that suggested decisions made quietly, then never revisited. The kind of things that don't stand out until someone looks at them with fresh eyes. What made this moment so powerful was its ordinariness. There was no dramatic discovery, no sudden realization, just a slow accumulation of unease. A growing sense that something had been left behind intentionally, not out of malice, but convenience, that the past hadn't been resolved, it had been stored. The basement seemed to embody that idea perfectly, a place beneath the public spaces of faith and gathering, holding what didn't fit neatly into the story people prefer to tell. It wasn't hidden in the sense of being secret. It was hidden in the sense of being overlooked. By the time the work paused for the day, no one wanted to say what they were thinking. But everyone felt it. The assumption that the disappearance belonged entirely to the past was no longer secure. The line between then and now had thinned, made fragile by the simple act of looking where no one had looked in a long time. What had once felt settled, unsolved, but distant, now felt unfinished again. And as the lights were switched off and the basement stairs climbed, the town carried something new back into the present. The uncomfortable possibility that the answers had never been far away at all. The discovery did not arrive with drama. There was no moment where everything stopped, no sharp intake of breath that signaled clear before and after. Instead, it unfolded the way truth often does when it has been buried for too long, slowly, reluctantly, and with a weight that only became fully apparent after it settled in. What was found in the basement was not sensational in isolation. If someone had stumbled across it years earlier, without context, it might not have meant much at all. But context was everything. Decades of silence pressed down on even the smallest detail. Giving it gravity it could not have carried on its own. It began with records. Documents that should have followed a clear order, but didn't. Files that were incomplete, dates that skipped inexplicably, references to meetings or decisions that were never reflected anywhere else. The kind of administrative loose end that suggests not chaos, but choice. Someone, at some point, had decided not to finish the story on paper. Then there were objects, not overtly alarming, not immediately identifiable as evidence of anything criminal, but undeniably connected to a time long thought sealed off. Items that belonged to the era of the disappearance. Items that, according to memory, should not have still been there. Their presence was quiet, but accusatory in its own way. The longer people sat with what had been found, the clearer it became that the basement wasn't just storing forgotten things. It was storing decisions, moments when someone had chosen discretion over disclosure, order over honesty, the easier path over the right one. What emerged was not a single, clean answer to what happened, but something more disturbing, an outline of awareness. It suggested that the disappearance had not gone entirely unnoticed at the time, that questions had been raised behind closed doors, that information had passed through hands that understood its significance, and then chose not to let it travel any further. There was no evidence of panic in those choices, no sense of urgency, only containment. That realization changed everything. For years, the disappearance had been framed as a mystery defined by ignorance. No one knew. No one could have known. But the basement told a different story, one where knowledge existed in fragments, dispersed among a few, then quietly absorbed into the structure of the institution itself. The church, long regarded as a place of refuge, now appeared in a more complicated light, not as a villain, not as a mastermind, but as a system capable of prioritizing its own stability above all else. The basement was not a hiding place in the dramatic sense. It was an archive of avoidance, and that distinction mattered. There was no single name to blame, no clear moment to point to and say, this is where it all went wrong. Instead, there was a pattern of restraint, of delayed action, of assuming that silence would be kinder than truth, that time would smooth over what clarity might disturb. The objects and records did not scream guilt. They whispered responsibility. As word of the discovery spread, carefully, selectively at first, the town reacted in layers. Shock came first, followed closely by defensiveness. Some refused to believe that anything meaningful had been uncovered. Others minimized its significance, insisting that old records could be misleading, that interpretations could be wrong. But for those who had spent years living with unanswered questions, the discovery felt like confirmation, not of what happened exactly, but of what had always been suspected, that the disappearance was not just an accident of fate, but the result of choices made in moments of quiet authority. Emotionally, this was a turning point. The mystery was no longer abstract. It was no longer something that belonged to the past in a general, untouchable way. It was now anchored to a place everyone knew, a place many had trusted, a place that stood as a symbol of moral clarity, while holding ambiguity beneath its floors. What made it especially painful was the ordinariness of it all. There was no grand conspiracy, no elaborate cover-up, just a series of small decisions that, together, allowed a person to disappear not only from the town, but from accountability. The basement had remembered what the town had tried to forget. As the implications settled in, people were forced to confront a difficult truth. The disappearance had been shaped not just by what happened on Christmas Day, but by what followed, by the decision to protect institutions over individuals, by the belief that stability mattered more than certainty. The haunting part was not what was found, but what it revealed about human behavior, about how easily silence can become policy, about how moral compromises are rarely made in moments of panic, but in moments of calm justification. By the end of it, the mystery had transformed. It was no longer about how someone vanished without a trace. It was about how an entire community, slowly and unintentionally, helped make that vanishing permanent. And the basement, once just a forgotten space beneath a place of worship, had become something else entirely. It had become a witness. The truth, once it surfaced, did not move quickly. It didn't rush through the town like a storm, tearing everything apart in one decisive moment. Instead, it spread slowly, unevenly, settling into conversations, glances, and silences. People absorbed it in pieces, each fragment reshaping their understanding of the past in ways that felt deeply personal and, at times, unbearable. At first, there was disbelief, not loud or angry, but quiet and stubborn. Many struggled to reconcile what had been uncovered with what they believed they knew. The church had always been steady, reliable, moral. It had been there at every turning point of their lives. To imagine that it could also be the place where truth stalled, where clarity was quietly set aside, felt like a betrayal of memory itself. So people searched for softer interpretations. They told themselves the records were incomplete, the objects misinterpreted, the conclusions exaggerated by time. They reminded one another that things were different back then, that decisions were made under pressure, with limited information, that intentions mattered more than outcomes. These explanations were not lies, exactly, but they were shields raised instinctively against the discomfort of accountability. As more details came to light, those shields began to crack. What unsettled the town most was not the idea that mistakes had been made, but the realization that those mistakes had been sustained. That silence had not been a temporary response to uncertainty, but a long-term strategy. That generation after generation had inherited a version of events that was incomplete by design. This was when the questions changed. No longer were people asking only what happened to the missing person. They began asking why certain actions weren't taken, why certain conversations never reached the wider community, why the disappearance had been framed as unknowable when it clearly hadn't been, at least not entirely. Responsibility, once diffuse and abstract, began to feel uncomfortably close. Some of the people implicated by the discovery were no longer alive. Others were elderly, long removed from positions of authority. This complicated the town's response. Anger had no clear target. Accountability had no obvious path forward. The people who might have explained their choices were either gone or unwilling to revisit them. That absence of resolution mirrored the original disappearance in a painful way. Town meetings were held, though they were often tense and carefully moderated. Statements were issued measured, cautious, heavy with language about regret and reflection. Apologies were implied rather than spoken outright. No one wanted to inflame divisions, yet the divisions were already there, quietly shaping how people listened and responded. For some, the revelations brought relief, not because the truth was comforting, but because uncertainty had finally shifted into something solid. They could grieve properly now, with clarity rather than questions. They could name what had been lost, not just a person, but honesty, courage, and trust. For others, the truth felt like an attack. It threatened the foundations of their faith, not just spiritually, but socially. The church had been more than a building. It had been a moral reference point. To see it implicated, even indirectly, forced a reckoning that went beyond one disappearance. The town was no longer united in how it remembered its own past. Conversations became sharper. Old arguments resurfaced in new forms. People who had once stood side by side now found themselves on opposite ends of an invisible divide. Those who wanted full transparency, and those who feared what transparency might unravel. What made this moment especially painful was the realization that accountability was not about punishment. It was about acknowledgement. And acknowledgement required admitting that the story everyone had lived with was incomplete. The missing person, once the center of quiet sympathy, now became the center of moral reckoning. Their absence was no longer just a tragedy. It was evidence. Evidence of what happens when institutions choose stability over truth, when communities prioritize harmony over honesty. Some asked why the past had to be disturbed at all. Why now, after so many years? Why reopen wounds that time had at least partially closed? These questions carried genuine exhaustion. People were tired, not just of the story, but of what it demanded emotionally. But others argued that time had not healed anything. It had only numbed it. The truth, once exposed, refused to be neutral. It demanded engagement. It forced people to examine their own roles, however small. Even those who had been children at the time felt implicated, not by action, but by inheritance. They had grown up benefiting from a version of peace that had been purchased with silence. And that realization lingered. The church itself stood unchanged, its walls bearing witness to generations of faith and failure alike. Services continued, though attendance shifted. Some people stayed out of loyalty. Others stayed out of hope that confronting the truth could lead to something better. And some stayed away entirely, unable to reconcile their memories with what they now knew. What emerged was not consensus, but complexity. The town did not collapse under the weight of the truth, nor did it fully resolve it. Instead, it entered a new phase, one marked by awareness rather than certainty. The past could no longer be spoken of in simple terms. Every retelling now carried a pause, a hesitation, an acknowledgement of what had been left unsaid for too long. The disappearance was no longer just a mystery. It was a mirror reflecting the cost of silence, the ease with which good intentions can lead to harmful outcomes, the way institutions, especially trusted ones, can drift away from accountability without ever feeling malicious. And perhaps most painfully, it reflected how ordinary people become part of that process, not through cruelty, but through compliance. In the end, the town was left with no clean ending, no courtroom resolution, No confession that tied everything together. What it gained instead was something less satisfying, but more honest: understanding. Understanding that the disappearance had not been an isolated event, but part of a larger pattern of avoidance. Understanding that faith and morality are not the same thing, and that one can exist without the other. Understanding that truth, when delayed, does not lose its power. It only changes who it hurts. The reckoning was incomplete, but it was real. And as the town moved forward, carrying both its traditions and its newly exposed past, one thing became impossible to deny. The disappearance had never truly ended. It had only been waiting for the moment when the community would finally be forced to look at itself and decide whether living with the truth, however painful, was better than living without it. Christmas returned the way it always did. Quietly at first, then all at once. Lights appeared in windows. Evergreen wreaths were hung on doors. The familiar songs filled the air again, melodies that had once promised comfort without complication. But now, they carried something else beneath them. A history that could no longer be ignored. A truth that had permanently altered the shape of remembrance. For the first time in decades, Christmas in the town was no longer just about celebration. It was about reckoning. People noticed a change in subtle ways. A longer pause during certain hymns. A name spoken aloud for the first time in years. Sometimes haltingly. Sometimes with tears that surprised even the person shedding them. There was no official declaration. No single moment where the town collectively decided to remember differently. It happened the way most emotional shifts do. Unevenly, imperfectly, and without permission. The missing person was no longer a shadow at the edge of the story. They were brought back into the center, not physically, but emotionally. People spoke about who they had been, not just what had happened to them. Small details resurfaced, laughs remembered, habits recalled, moments that had once felt too painful to share. These memories did not provide closure, but they restored something essential that had been missing all along: humanity. For years, the disappearance had been framed as a mystery to be solved or endured. Now, it was also understood as a loss that had been mishandled, a grief that had been postponed rather than processed, a truth that had been set aside for the sake of stability. Christmas, once the backdrop of the vanishing, became the mirror reflecting its consequences. The church held services as it always had, but the atmosphere was different. The words spoken from the front no longer felt insulated from the past. References to light and darkness landed with greater weight. Silence, once comforting, now felt charged, something to be examined rather than accepted. The building itself seemed altered, not because it had changed, but because people had. Some found this transformation healing. They felt that at last, the story had been allowed to breathe. Others struggled deeply. For them, the holiday had always been a refuge, a time when the world made sense. Now, even Christmas carried complexity. Even faith felt layered with doubt. There was no universal response, and that, too, was part of the reckoning. The town did not agree on what accountability should look like. Some believed acknowledgement was enough, that naming the failure was the most meaningful step possible after so much time. Others wanted more: formal apologies, public records, institutional changes that went beyond words. These disagreements sometimes flared into conflict, but more often they simmered quietly, reflecting how differently people process the same truth. What united them, however imperfectly, was the understanding that pretending nothing had happened was no longer an option. The disappearance had reshaped the town's moral memory. It was no longer just a story about someone who went missing. It was a story about how communities choose what to see, what to protect, and what to leave behind. It forced a question that lingered far beyond a single case. How many other truths have been quietly set aside, not out of malice, but convenience? As the years moved forward, the church basement remained unchanged physically, but symbolically it became something else entirely. No longer just a storage space. It existed in collective memory as a reminder of what happens when things are buried rather than faced. People spoke of it differently now, with awareness rather than indifference. It had become part of the story, whether anyone liked it or not. Children growing up in the town learned a different version of the past than their parents had. They were told not just that someone disappeared, but that the disappearance had been mishandled, that silence had played a role. This honesty was uncomfortable, but it mattered. It taught them that institutions are not infallible, and that truth requires effort, not assumption. In that way, the story became a cautionary one, not just about loss, but about responsibility for the family. The truth brought neither peace nor resolution, but it did bring recognition. Their grief was no longer isolated or politely ignored. It was acknowledged as something the entire town had participated in, whether intentionally or not. That recognition did not fill the absence, but it softened the sharpest edge of it. They were no longer alone with the unanswered questions. Still, some things could never be undone. Time had taken too much. Opportunities for justice, for clarity, for direct accountability had slipped away with the people who might have provided them. The town had to live with that reality. The knowledge that truth delayed is not the same as truth delivered. And yet, something remained. The story, once fragmented and suppressed, was now whole enough to be told honestly. It no longer belonged only to rumor or silence. It had shape, meaning, consequence. Each Christmas after that carried the weight of remembrance, but also something gentler, intention. The town remembered not just the loss, but the lesson. That safety is not guaranteed by tradition. That faith without accountability can become hollow. That silence, even when it feels kind, can be deeply harmful. The haunting part was not that the disappearance had happened. It was that it had been allowed to fade. And now, finally, it no longer could. As lights continued to glow and bells continued to ring, the town understood something it hadn't before. Closure is not always about answers. Sometimes it is about acknowledgement, about refusing to let absence remain unnamed, about choosing to remember fully, even when memory is painful. The missing person never returned, but they were no longer gone without a trace. They lived on in the uncomfortable truths the town now carried, in the awareness that settled beneath every familiar ritual, in the understanding that what disappears is not always lost forever. Sometimes it is simply waiting to be seen. And every Christmas after that, beneath the hymns and the lights and the carefully repeated traditions, the town remembered not just what had vanished, but what it had taken to finally face it. In the end, there was no single answer waiting to tie everything together. No final revelation that could return what had been lost or explain it in a way that felt complete. What remained instead was something quieter, heavier, and far more lasting, a change in how the town understood itself and the story it had carried for so long. From the outside, life continued as it always had. New families moved in, unaware of the full history beneath their feet. Others moved away, carrying fragments of the story with them, never quite sure how to explain it elsewhere. The streets looked the same. The church still stood at the center of town, unchanged in shape, if not in meaning. Seasons passed in their familiar order, and on the surface, nothing appeared broken. But beneath that normalcy, something fundamental had shifted. The disappearance was no longer just a mystery from the past. It had become a reference point, a quiet reminder woven into how people spoke, how they listened, how they chose their silences. It lived in the pauses that followed certain questions, in the care taken when telling old stories. The town had learned that forgetting was not the same as healing. The church, too, existed differently now. It remained a place of gathering and faith, but it was no longer seen as untouchable. People understood, perhaps for the first time, that institutions are shaped by human choices, and that morality can erode quietly when comfort is prioritized over truth. For some, this realization deepened their faith. For others, it fractured it. But for everyone, it removed illusion. The basement remained physically unchanged, concrete floors, low ceilings, shelves lined with boxes, but symbolically, it had become something else. It stood as a reminder of what happens when things are stored instead of confronted. No one spoke of it lightly anymore. It was no longer just a space beneath the church. It was part of the story. What lingered most powerfully was a realization of how close the truth had come to disappearing forever, if not for chance, if not for time, if not for someone deciding to look where no one had looked in years. The town slowly came to understand that the disappearance had endured not because it was unknowable, but because it was inconvenient. Facing it fully would have required difficult conversations, uncomfortable accountability, and the willingness to disrupt the sense of stability that had been carefully preserved. Silence had been easier. Over time, silence had felt normal. That understanding changed how people saw other things, too. Old disagreements, unresolved conflicts, moments where the truth had been softened or postponed for the sake of peace. The disappearance cast a long shadow, asking questions that reached far beyond one person and one Christmas day. It forced the town to consider how often silence had been mistaken for kindness, and how often avoidance had been disguised as wisdom. The missing person was never found, not in the way closure is usually imagined. There were no remains, no final confirmation that could end the questions completely. That absence remained, unresolved to the very end. But something else was found, an awareness that disappearance is not always a single act. Sometimes it is a process, one built slowly through neglect, deflection, and small decisions made by people who believe they are protecting something greater than the truth. No one involved had likely thought of themselves as doing harm. That was the most unsettling part. There was no clear villain, no dramatic conspiracy, no moment of deliberate cruelty. Just ordinary people choosing silence because it felt safer, choosing stability because it felt responsible, choosing not to ask questions because they feared what the answers might demand of them. Years later, visitors to the town would see nothing unusual. They would notice the quiet streets, the sense of closeness, the pride in tradition. If they heard the story at all, it would be simplified, a disappearance, long ago never solved. They would not feel the weight behind it. Only those who stayed carried that weight. They carried it in the way certain traditions were now approached with more care, in the understanding that safety is not guaranteed by familiarity, in the knowledge that faith without accountability can become hollow. The disappearance had changed the town not by destroying it, but by forcing it to grow more honest. Endings, the town learned, are not always about answers. Sometimes they are about responsibility. The responsibility to remember truthfully, to question what feels unquestionable, to speak when silence is easiest. The story never truly ended. It remained as a warning rather than a wound, a reminder that what is buried does not disappear. It waits. That truth delayed does not lose its power. It accumulates weight, and that communities are shaped as much by what they choose not to see as by what they confront directly. Every Christmas, when the lights return and the bells ring across the snow, the town feels it again. Not fear, not panic, but awareness. The day still holds warmth. The rituals still matter. The songs are still sung. But beneath it all lies an understanding that can never be undone. Some disappearances are not accidents of fate. They are the result of silence layered so carefully over time that it becomes part of the foundation itself. And once that truth is seen, once it is fully acknowledged, it cannot be unseen. The person who vanished never returned, but they were no longer gone without a trace. They remain in the lesson the town now carried forward. That truth, even when delayed for decades, still demands to be faced, and that looking away is sometimes the most powerful act of disappearance of all.